He was born on a morning that should have been ordinary. The sky above his village stretched wide and pale, the kind of sky that promised rain later but offered none yet. Roosters crowed. Women swept dust from the thresholds of their homes with patient hands. The earth smelled of clay and smoke, of life continuing as it always had. Yet the moment he drew his first breath, the world had already decided how far that breath would be allowed to travel. He was born black in a land where blackness was both home and sentence. The village elders gathered later that day beneath the old tree at the edge of the settlement, the one whose roots twisted above ground like veins on an aged hand. They spoke softly of lineage and ancestors, of names passed down through generations, of spirits who watched from the unseen world. Tradition wrapped the child in meaning. But beyond the village, beyond the dusty paths and rivers, there were laws that did not recognize ancestry or spirit. Laws written in a language that did not care who you were, only what color you were. His mother held him close, humming a song older than memory. She whispered prayers into his hair, not knowing she was also whispering warnings. In her arms, he was innocent. In the eyes of the state, he was already lesser. As he grew, the contradictions of his world revealed themselves slowly, like cracks spreading across a wall. At home, he was taught to stand tall. His father spoke of dignity as if it were a second spine. A man is not measured by what he owns, he would say, but by what he refuses to surrender. Around the evening fire, stories were told of warriors and kings, of black men who ruled lands and shaped history long before foreign boots touched their soil. In those moments, the boy felt powerful, seen, whole. But outside the village, the world demanded he shrink. He noticed it first in silence. How adult men lowered their voices when officials passed. How laughter died quickly in certain spaces. How eyes dropped to the ground, not from respect, but from survival. He noticed how his father's shoulders stiffened when documents were checked, how his mother's hand tightened around his wrist when uniforms appeared on the road. He did not yet understand the laws, but he understood fear. At school, he learned numbers and letters, but also boundaries. Where he could sit, where he could walk, which questions were dangerous. History books spoke of progress and order, yet none of the heroes looked like him. The absence was loud. It told him that his people were expected to exist quietly, gratefully, invisibly. One afternoon, he watched a man from the village, an elder known for wisdom, stand before an official half his age. The elder spoke carefully, respectfully, choosing each word as though stepping across broken glass. The official did not listen. He did not have to. The law was already on his side. That was the moment something shifted inside the boy. It was not anger at first. It was clarity. He began to see that the injustice around him was not chaos. It was structure. It was not hatred alone. It was design. The roads that bypassed his village. The schools that lacked books. The rules that changed depending on who enforced them. This was not accidental suffering. It was organized. At night, lying beside his siblings, he stared into the dark and listened to the breathing of the house. He imagined the land as it could be. Voices raised without fear, backs unbent, children born without limits placed on their futures. He did not yet know how such a world could exist. He only knew that the one he lived in was wrong. The elders said some children were born with old souls. If that was true, his soul had come prepared. Because even then, before speeches, before prisons, before history learned his name, something quiet but unbreakable took root within him. A refusal. A promise to himself that whatever the world demanded he accept without question, he would question anyway. Under that shadowed sky, a flame was lit. Not loud, not visible, but patient. The boy did not wake up one morning suddenly aware of injustice. Awakening, for him, was gradual, like dawn creeping across the land, light touching some places first while others remained stubbornly dark. His first true awakening came through books. At school, he learned to read with hunger, as though words themselves were nourishment. While other children rushed through lessons eager for the bell, he lingered over pages, tracing sentences with his finger, asking questions teachers did not always welcome. He noticed which topics were explained fully and which were hurried past. He noticed how history paused whenever it approached the lives of people reminder of him, then resumed elsewhere, as though black existence were an inconvenient interruption. But education did more than expose absence, It sharpened contrast. In the classroom, the law was described as neutral, orderly, fair. Outside, he watched it applied like a weapon. He saw men arrested not for crimes, but for standing in the wrong place too long. He saw families uprooted by papers signed in offices they would never enter. He saw how the same act could be punished or ignored depending on the color of the hands that committed it. The contradiction disturbed him deeply. He began asking questions his teachers avoided answering. Why are some laws permanent for us and temporary for others? Why does justice sound different in practice than it does in books? Some instructors dismissed him. Others warned him quietly. A few looked at him with something like fear, not of rebellion yet, but of thought. Outside school, the world continued its lessons. He worked small jobs to support his family, interacting more with the system that governed them. He stood in long lines where dignity was stripped away by routine humiliation. He watched officials misuse power casually, as if cruelty were simply part of their job description. He realized that oppression did not always shout. Often, it whispered reminders of one's place. What troubled him most was how normal it all seemed. People adapted. They adjusted their dreams. They learned which battles were not worth it. Survival required silence, and silence slowly turned into habit. He saw good men shrink themselves to fit narrow spaces. He saw women carry strength quietly, knowing the cost of being seen as defiant. That was when the awakening truly took hold. Oppression, he understood, was not sustained only by force. It was sustained by acceptance. The realization unsettled him more than fear ever could. At night, he debated with himself. Who was he to question systems that had existed longer than his lifetime? Who was he to imagine change when generations before him had endured without success? Yet another voice, steadier, more insistent, answered back. If injustice is learned, it can be unlearned. University expanded his world further. There, ideas clashed openly. He encountered thinkers who spoke of rights, resistance, and liberation. He read about revolutions that began with nothing more than refusal. He learned that laws were written by men, and could be rewritten by men willing to risk everything. This knowledge did not comfort him. It burdened him. Because once you understand that oppression is designed, you can no longer pretend it is inevitable. Once you see the machinery behind suffering, neutrality becomes impossible. Silence becomes a choice, and a betrayal. He began to speak, first in small circles, then in larger ones. His words were careful at first, shaped by caution. But the more he spoke, the more clearly he saw the hunger in others' eyes. People were not waiting for permission to be free. They were waiting for someone to articulate what they had always known, but never dared to say aloud. That frightened him. Because he understood what speaking meant. It meant surveillance. It meant consequences. It meant stepping out of the narrow safety that silence provided. And yet, the alternative, knowing the truth and refusing to act, felt like a slower, deeper kind of death. One evening, after a long debate that left his hands shaking, he walked alone beneath the same wide sky he had been born under. The stars were distant but steady. He thought of his parents, of the village, of children being born into the same shadowed future he had inherited. And in that moment, he made a decision that would change the course of his life. Freedom would never be given. It would have to be demanded. Not recklessly, not blindly, but deliberately, persistently, and with a courage that did not depend on the absence of fear. The awakening was complete. What came next would require a voice, and he was no longer willing to keep his silent. The first time he spoke publicly, his voice did not roar. It trembled. He stood before a small gathering, workers, students, mothers holding children on their hips, beneath a sun that offered no mercy. His palms were damp. His heartbeat felt louder than his words. He had rehearsed the speech a dozen times in his head, but when he opened his mouth, what came out was not polished rhetoric. It was truth, raw and unguarded. He spoke of everyday humiliations people had learned to endure, of laws that claimed order while delivering cruelty, of a future that kept shrinking the longer they remained silent. He did not shout. He did not insult. He simply named reality. And naming it changed everything. Something electric passed through the crowd, not excitement alone, but recognition. Heads lifted, backs straightened. People exchanged glances that said, "I thought I was alone in seeing this." When he finished, The applause was hesitant at first, then steady, then fierce. Not because he had said something new, but because he had said something forbidden. Word spread quickly. He was invited to speak again, at a meeting, then another, then another. Each time, the crowd grew. With each gathering, his voice strengthened, not because fear disappeared, but because purpose outweighed it. He learned how to shape his words into bridges, connecting pain to possibility, anger to discipline, fear to resolve. Marches followed speeches. People who had once walked with their eyes lowered now walked side by side, shoulders brushing, footsteps synchronized. Songs rose into the air, old melodies reborn with new meaning. Placards appeared, handwritten and imperfect, yet powerful precisely because they came from ordinary hands. The system responded as systems always do when challenged. Warnings came first, then threats, then labels. He was called disruptive, dangerous, a criminal in waiting. Newspapers twisted his words. Authorities attended meetings quietly, taking notes, memorizing faces. Friends urged caution. Family members worried aloud. Strangers followed him through streets he once walked freely. Fear returned, but this time, it was different. It no longer belonged solely to him. He felt it ripple through every crowd he addressed. He saw it in the way people flinched at sirens, in how mothers clutched children tighter during demonstrations. He understood that leadership did not mean standing above fear. It meant standing inside it without allowing it to decide the outcome. Then came the raids. Meetings were broken up. Homes were searched. Names were added to lists that promised consequences. Some supporters disappeared for days, then returned quieter, bruised, changed. Others did not return at all. Each loss weighed heavily on him. Late at night, he questioned himself. Am I leading people toward freedom or into harm? The burden of influence pressed down hard. Words could inspire, yes, but they could also provoke violence from those determined to maintain control. He adjusted, refined, persisted. He emphasized discipline, nonviolence, strategy. He reminded people that dignity was a weapon no force could disarm. That rage without direction would consume them before it consumed injustice. His speeches became mirrors, forcing the nation to confront itself, not as it claimed to be, but as it truly was. That was what frightened those in power most. Not his anger, not his defiance, his clarity. Because clarity cannot be negotiated away. When they finally arrested him, it was done with formality, as if legality could disguise intent. The charges were broad, flexible, designed to fit any outcome. He stood before the court calm, knowing the verdict had been decided long before he entered the room. But when given a chance to speak, he did not plead. He explained. He explained why silence was no longer possible, why laws that dehumanized could not command obedience, why loving one's people sometimes required defying the state. His words traveled far beyond the courtroom, carried by whispers, by memory, by those who would repeat them long after he was taken away. As the cell door closed behind him for the first time, the sound echoed sharply, metal against metal, final and deliberate. Yet inside him, something remained unshaken. They had taken his freedom of movement. They had taken his platform. But they had failed to silence his voice. Because by then, it no longer belonged to him alone. It lived in the streets, in the songs, in the quiet courage of people who had learned to stand upright. And even behind bars, he knew one truth with absolute certainty. Once a people learned to speak without permission, they never fully returned to silence. Prison did not announce itself with cruelty alone. It announced itself with routine. The first days were filled with instructions, where to stand, when to move, when to speak, when to remain silent. His name was replaced with a number. His clothes were exchanged for rough fabric that carried the weight of many men before him. The walls were bare, the air heavy with disinfectant and history. The cell was small enough that he could touch both walls at once, as if the space itself were testing how much of him could be contained. At night, the silence was deceptive. It was broken by distant coughs, murmured prayers, the soft scrape of footsteps on concrete. Sometimes there were cries, quickly suppressed. Sometimes laughter, sharp and brief, like a memory escaping before it could be punished. He learned to listen without looking, to read emotion and sound alone. Time changed shape in prison. Days stretched thin, then folded in on themselves. Weeks passed unnoticed. Years arrived quietly. His body aged in ways he could not fully see, but he felt it, in his joints, in the stiffness of mornings, in the slower recovery from fatigue. The guards noticed too. They mistook endurance for weakness, patience for surrender. They were wrong. At first, isolation pressed hard against his thoughts. Without crowds, without speeches, without movement, doubt crept in. He replayed moments from the past, wondering which words had pushed events toward this outcome. He worried about those outside, whether the movement would survive without him, whether fear would reclaim the ground courage had won. But prison had a way of sharpening focus. Stripped of distractions, he returned to first principles. Why had he begun this journey? What did freedom truly mean? He realized that resistance did not always require action. Sometimes it required refusal, to hate, to despair, to become small. He began to study his captors. He watched how power expressed itself in small humiliations, unnecessary delays, withheld privileges, casual insults delivered as policy. He saw how some guards avoided his eyes, uncomfortable with their role. Others leaned into it, drawing identity from authority. From both, he learned. He chose dignity deliberately. He stood straight during inspections. He spoke respectfully, but firmly. He did not beg. He did not provoke. Each act was measured, intentional. Resistance, he understood, could be quiet and still relentless. Other prisoners noticed. They began to gather around him during permitted moments, drawn not by charisma alone, but by steadiness. He listened more than he spoke. He learned their stories. Farmers, workers, students, fathers. Men broken not just by confinement, but by the belief that they had been forgotten. He reminded them they were still seen. Education returned, this time without classrooms. He shared ideas remembered from books, from debates, from experience. In return, he learned patience, humility, and the many forms courage could take. Together, they turned stolen moments into lessons, turning confinement into a strange kind of school. The authorities responded as expected. Privileges were revoked. Transfers were threatened. Solitary confinement loomed as punishment for influence they pretended not to notice. In isolation, the walls felt closer. Days blurred. Yet, even alone, he refused to surrender his mind. He recited memories, reconstructed arguments, spoke to himself to preserve clarity. He discovered something vital in those moments. They could confine his body, but they could not reach the part of him that chose meaning. That part remained free, not because of hope alone, but because of discipline. Letters arrived irregularly, censored and delayed. News from outside came in fragments. He learned that his name was being spoken in places he had never seen, by people he had never met. The knowledge warmed him more than sunlight ever could. Years later, when younger prisoners arrived already knowing who he was, he understood fully what prison had made of him. A symbol. Not one he had sought, but one shaped by time, endurance, and refusal. He worried about the danger of symbols, how they could flatten complexity, turn men into myths. Yet he also understood their power. Symbols carried hope across distances no individual could travel. Concrete walls could not stop that. As decades passed, the state that had imprisoned him began to change. Quiet negotiations replaced loud certainty. Questions once dismissed returned with urgency. The system that had declared him dangerous now faced a different threat: his survival. Because survival itself had become resistance. In chains and concrete, freedom had not died. It had learned how to wait. The world beyond the prison walls did not change all at once. At first, it shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a tide turning beneath the surface. A whispered name passed from mouth to mouth. A photograph appeared in a foreign newspaper. A question was asked in a place far removed from the dust and concrete of his confinement. Who is this man, and why is he still imprisoned? Distance gave his story wings. Students in distant cities held discussions late into the night, arguing about justice in lands they had never visited but could no longer ignore. Workers marched during lunch breaks. Churches and meeting halls echoed with prayers that named him alongside freedom itself. His imprisonment, once meant to isolate and erase, had instead given him a strange kind of immortality. Governments began to notice. At first, they spoke cautiously, balancing words against interests. Statements were drafted with care, language softened to avoid offense. But pressure does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it accumulates, petition by petition, protest by protest, until silence becomes more dangerous than speech. Sanctions followed speeches. Boycotts followed songs. Questions followed excuses. The state that held him tried to control the narrative. They insisted he was a criminal, a threat to order, a man out of step with progress. But the longer he remained imprisoned, the more fragile those claims sounded. Criminals faded into obscurity. This man did not. Inside the prison, he learned of these developments slowly. A guard mentioned a headline with irritation. A letter hinted at demonstrations abroad. A new prisoner arrived already aware of his name, already treating him with a reverence that felt both humbling and heavy. Each fragment confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The struggle had outgrown him. That realization brought both comfort and unease. He was glad the movement no longer depended on his physical presence. Yet he worried about misinterpretation. He worried that anger might harden into cruelty, that freedom might be imagined as revenge. He wished he could speak to everyone, guide the conversation, remind them that liberation without humanity was only another form of domination. But prison limited voice, not influence. Writers began quoting his courtroom words. Musicians turned his name into a chorus. Artists painted his face as both man and symbol, lines deepened by imagination, eyes steady with resolve. His absence allowed people to project their hopes onto him, and he prayed silently that he would be worthy of them. International pressure intensified. Economic strain revealed cracks in the system. Allies grew uneasy. Leaders who had once defended oppression as tradition now struggled to justify it in a changing world. The language of inevitability weakened. The language of reform crept in. Inside, negotiations were whispered about, denied publicly, discussed privately. Officials visited him, not with apologies, but with curiosity. They asked questions disguised as conversations. They tested his tone, his willingness to compromise, his limits. He answered carefully. He spoke of dignity before power, of equality before stability, of peace that required justice, not the silence of the oppressed. He refused to trade freedom for comfort or principle for position. Each meeting ended without resolution, but with a deeper understanding that the future could not be postponed forever. The world was listening now, not because he demanded attention, but because the truth had become too loud to ignore. His imprisonment had exposed the system more clearly than any speech outside ever could. Every year he remained behind bars was another question without a convincing answer. Justice delayed. The world began to understand. Was injustice revealed? And somewhere beyond the walls, the sound of that understanding grew louder. The day the gates opened did not feel triumphant at first. There were no trumpets, no sudden shift in the air that announced history was being made. The morning was ordinary, cool, measured, almost cautious, as though the world itself was holding its breath. He dressed slowly, hands steady despite the weight of the moment. The clothes felt unfamiliar on his body, softer than prison fabric, lighter than memory. When he stepped outside, sunlight touched his face in a way it had not for decades. He paused. Not because he was weak, but because freedom requires orientation. The world was wider now, louder, filled with faces both known and imagined. Cheers rose, waves of sound crashing into him. He lifted his hand, not in victory, but in acknowledgement. This moment was not his alone. Every step forward carried the echo of those who had not lived to see it. Cameras captured the image, a man walking out of confinement with his back straight, his expression calm. What they could not capture was the discipline behind that calm. The years of choosing patience over bitterness, clarity over rage. Many expected anger. Some feared revenge. He offered neither. He offered resolve. The transition was not immediate. Freedom did not erase scars, nor did it undo decades of division. He entered a nation fractured by fear, inequality carved into daily life. The temptation to settle scores was strong, voiced loudly by those who had suffered deeply and long. He listened. He understood their pain intimately. He carried his own. But he also understood something else. A future built on vengeance would collapse under its own weight. Liberation demanded more than release. It demanded transformation. He spoke of unity, not as forgetfulness, but as strategy. He spoke of justice that did not require cruelty. He insisted that reconciliation was not weakness, but strength refined by wisdom. His words unsettled both allies and former enemies. They expected simplicity. He gave them complexity. Leadership came not through force, but through example. He met with those who had once ordered his imprisonment, looking them in the eye without submission or hatred. He met with communities still living in the shadow of oppression, promising change without fantasy. He reminded the nation that freedom was not a finish line, it was work. When he finally stood before the people as a leader, the symbolism was unmistakable. A man once deemed unfit to exist freely now guided the future. The sight alone challenged assumptions that had shaped generations. Yet he refused to rule as a symbol alone. He governed with patience, compromise, and moral insistence. Mistakes were made. Progress was uneven. The weight of expectation was immense. But through it all, he remained anchored in principle. Dignity was non-negotiable. He walked through spaces once forbidden, not to claim ownership, but to reclaim belonging. He spoke to children about responsibility as much as rights. He reminded the powerful that authority without justice was temporary. The world watched closely. Some praised him as extraordinary. Others criticized him as too forgiving. He accepted neither label fully. He knew that leadership was not about satisfying applause. It was about sustaining peace long enough for justice to take root. When he looked back on the long path from prison to presidency, from silence to speech, from captivity to command, he did not see victory. He saw duty. And he carried it upright, step by step, into a future still being written. Freedom did not arrive and settle. It moved. It shifted shape, changed hands, demanded tending. He understood this more clearly than most, because he had seen what happened when freedom was treated as a destination instead of a practice. Long after the celebrations quieted and the headlines moved on, he remained alert to the subtle ways injustice could return, wearing new language, hiding behind new systems, speaking in gentler tones. Leadership, he knew, was temporary. Legacy was not. As the years passed, he stepped back deliberately, resisting the temptation to cling to power. He had fought too hard against domination to reproduce it in another form. Instead, he focused on teaching, through words, through absence, through trust in those who would come after him. He reminded the nation that freedom did not belong to one man, one party, or one generation. It belonged to everyone, or it would belong to no one. He visited schools where children learned history differently now, where black names filled pages once empty. He listened to their questions, sharp and hopeful. Some asked about prison. Others asked about forgiveness. He answered honestly, refusing to simplify pain or romanticize suffering. He told them freedom was costly, not because struggle was noble, but because dignity demanded defense. Around the world, his story traveled far beyond its origins. Activists in other lands quoted him. Movements borrowed his discipline. His life became shorthand for endurance, his image for courage. He welcomed the influence, but cautioned against imitation without understanding. Context mattered. Freedom fought without wisdom could easily betray itself. Privately, he reflected often. On nights when the world was quiet, he returned in memory to the village under the shadowed sky. He thought of his parents, the elders, the men who had lowered their eyes, the women who had carried strength silently. He thought of the boy he had been, curious, unsettled, determined, and measured the distance traveled not in power gained, but in humanity preserved. He had been tested by hatred and refused to become its echo. That, more than any title, defined his victory. As age slowed his steps, his presence softened but did not fade. People still sought his counsel. Nations still listened when he spoke. Yet he insisted that the work no longer belonged to him. He reminded them that freedom survives only when ordinary people choose it daily, in how they govern, how they remember, how they treat one another. The fight for black independence, he insisted, was not finished because it was never meant to end. Not as conflict, but as commitment. When his voice finally quieted, the flame did not go out. It passed on. In classrooms where questions were encouraged. In streets where people stood without lowering their eyes. In laws rewritten to reflect humanity rather than hierarchy. Freedom lived on, not as a monument, but as a responsibility carried forward by those who understood its cost. And under skies no longer shadowed in the same way, children were born into a world still imperfect, still fragile, but undeniably changed. Because one man had refused to accept silence as destiny. Because he had understood that freedom, once lit, must be kept alive. Not by remembering him, but by continuing the work.